How's everybody doing this evening? Good, good. Thumbs up. I like to see that. Thumbs up. Glad to hear it. All right. Dennis, could we turn on the TV? Here's for reference. If you're just joining us for the first time, we are in a historical survey of the Old Testament. As I've mentioned a few times now, I bit off a little bit more than I could chew than what I thought I was going to do. I was going to cover the entire Old Testament in one quarter, and not able to do that for some reason. I got to get into a little bit more detail. It's on now, brother. Thank you. So we are now at the book of Numbers. So if you want to open your Bibles to Numbers, we'll look at that, and that's where we are in our study. I do want to back up just a little bit as far as information. Last week we looked at Leviticus, and there's a few things in Leviticus that will be brought out when we get to Deuteronomy as well, and that is we didn't get to talk much about the feasts, the different feasts that are mentioned in Leviticus, chapters 25, 23, and things like that, these various feasts that God instituted for the nation of Israel. And they're all very important, and we will look at those feasts individual in just a little bit. But wanted to just basically point out that from Leviticus, these various feasts and the priesthood itself were designed, God gave those to Israel to prepare the world for Jesus. All right, so it's not only just to teach Israel these things and to get them to understand obedience, but it's also to help us understand. That's why I think many times that Leviticus is called the gospel of the Old Testament, because it is a preparation for Jesus. All right, so we're now in Numbers. That's where we should be up to now, and in our study, looking at these books. And so in the book of Numbers, as we have been doing the last few weeks, I'll give you a little bit of a one-word summary. And the one-word summary that I like to use for the book of Numbers is orientation. So the first one was origins. That's Genesis, where everything begins, origins. Then the next thing is ordination, that ordaining of the priesthood. And now we're going to look at orientation. And there's several reasons for that word. Also discipline. Now he's getting into the real meat of some of the things that he wants Israel to do. The purpose of the book of Numbers is to teach trust in God. We've said many times, God has taken Israel out of Egypt, and now he's trying to get Egypt out of Israel. And so in order to do that, they are now wandering in the wilderness. They have received the law. They have received their marching orders, literally, which we're going to look at in just a moment. And now they go out and they start living as this nation of Israel. And as any nation who has ever been started always has those growing pains and always has those challenges. And indeed, the nation of Israel had its challenges, and that's what we see in the book of Numbers. Now, where do we see Jesus? We always say that every book shows Jesus. And so in this case, Jesus is referenced in a few different ways. But in this case specifically, or more directly, known as the Star of Jacob in Numbers 24, verse 17. Now, each time we talk about how we can divide these books, and as I mentioned, it's just a great way to help you understand and kind of get the book in your head. So there's different ways, and these same thing I've been showing you. Here's another one. So we can take the book of Numbers and divide it into 3 parts. You've seen us divide the previous books in 2 parts, 4 parts, and things like that. If you received it's called Numbers Horizontal from last week, you'll see that there's 3 parts that is divided in on the far right. And then it breaks it down even more parts coming to the left, and then you have those chapter divisions. Now what we have in these preachers that put these things together, I don't know what it is about preachers and alliteration. They didn't actually teach us that in school or anything. It's just something that we pick up on, and so I find it interesting. Every time I turn around, there's all this alliteration. And so here in the book of Numbers, we divide it into 3 parts: preparation, pessimism, and punishment. And we'll see some more in another division in just a moment. Now that first few chapters, chapters 1 through 9, this is where you're going to see the census, organization, and sanctification. You get in chapters 10 through 14, you start getting into some problems. They start complaining and they start having some issues. And then you wind up with punishment, as it says there, in the wandering. An old generation dies, a new census is taken, a new generation. You can also see those locations of where they are. In this book, as we mentioned a minute ago, Israel is now on the move. The last couple of books, they were right there in Mount Sinai, or getting to Sinai, and then at Sinai. Now we're moving beyond that and starting to wander in the wilderness, as we've shown that map a few times. Here's another division. Again, 3 different ways, and now more alliteration: walking, wandering, and waiting. And so whatever works, whatever it takes to get that in your head. For me, for example, I divide the book of Revelation into 7 parts, because there's that number 7. And each 7 parts has 7 sections within that. And so whatever it takes to help you remember. And again, you can find these on the internet. These are just real available. Just type in outline of the book of Numbers, and you will find 2 or 3 different types. All right, so here, again, it breaks it out into pretty good topics. It's talking about law and order, those first 12 chapters, moving into rebellion and disorder from 13 to 25, and then new laws for the new order in 26 through 36. You can also see a time frame there. Those first 12 chapters, all that takes place within about 2 months. But then chapters 13 through 25, 38 years. And so this is where the big chunk of the wilderness wandering takes place. I had a teacher at Southwest who used to say, I'm almost 2 wildernesses old. 40 years in the wilderness. That's how he measured everything. I'm almost 2 wildernesses old. And so here you can see that time frame of the book of Numbers. Now, in the book of Numbers, if you go, let's go ahead and open our Bibles to chapter 2. And one of the big verses here, literally, is verse 32. Numbers chapter 2, verse 32. This is one of the reasons why the book has the name Numbers, which we'll talk about some more in just a second. And so in chapter 2, verse 32, it says, these are the ones who were numbered of the children of Israel by their fathers' houses. All who were numbered according to their armies of the forces were 603,550. All right, so that's a big number. That's how many people. Now you got to realize this is a qualitative number. This isn't all the people. These are just those men who are capable of going to war. Now you think about the United States of America. If we were to take a census of just the capable men going to war, would that include everybody that's here in the United States? No. In fact, the majority of people in this room would not be included in that census. And so that's the same thing we have here. Now think about that. 603,000. So if you have mothers and fathers, elderly mothers and fathers, you have wives and children and others, okay, servants and things like that, you start getting into a really big number. You remember earlier we mentioned that it was we calculated at least 1 million, if not 2 million. And some go beyond that, but I think 2 million is beginning a pretty big stretch. So it's a lot of people. This is a big nation. Okay, so it's a lot of people. And then you can see up there above that you have, the reason being is because all these numbers. You back up in chapter 2 and you can see all of those numbers that are listed there. From the tribe of Ephraim, 40,500. From the tribe of Manasseh, 32,200. Benjamin, and it goes on down, all the different tribes. Now we need to back up and realize, we've talked about this a little bit, where did this come from? And it goes all the way back to Genesis, whenever those 70-plus people went down to Egypt. And then in Egypt, they were there for 400 years, multiplied into this nation. That all started with Abraham, going back to that covenant. We can't ever forget, as we're going through the Old Testament, there's this covenant that God has made, beginning first with Adam and Eve there, and then progressing into Abraham, and then on into his family, which progressed into Isaac and then Jacob. We talked about how Jacob had those 12 children, And one of the children, Joseph, it's two of his sons that actually turn into part of the tribes. And then you have another tribe that actually is taken out of the mix, which is Levi. And that's how you get to this number. Again, regarding that covenant, we have Judah as being the one in which the Messiah will come through. Is that all? Everybody remember all that? All right, good. We're doing good here. Now, I mentioned that the book of Numbers gets its name from this idea of numbers, and that comes from more of the Greek name that we find in the Septuagint and the Latin dealing with these census reports. But that's not, as we've seen several times, that is not the name of the book according to the Hebrews. Hebrews, again, didn't have chapters and numbers and things like that, so it was known as Bendabar, which means in the wilderness. And if you back up, verse number 1, chapter 1, you'll see now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. And that's the title of the book according to the Hebrews. All right, so this book contains modifications to the law. All right? Doesn't change, just modification of the law to clarifications and things like that, because you now have this large group of people, and God is getting more specific in these laws. And one of the things that he gets more specific on is the organization of the people. This is the map I'm talking about with those wilderness wanderings. You can see here, now that we're in Numbers, those chapters where they are. Chapters 1 through 10, they're still right there in Mount Sinai region. 11 through 12, they're moving on up into the wilderness area, and then they start making some loops. And 14 to 36, and by the time you get to the end, they're all the way up and near the Promised Land on the other side of Canaan, on the other side of Jordan from Canaan. And then you begin the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll talk about. So part of this is now we get into the organization of the people. So he's ordained his people. He's taken them out of Egypt. He's rescued them. He has ordained this worship that he wants, this priesthood and laws and things like that. And now he's going to get more specific with how the camp is to be organized. And so he's already given all these instructions on the tabernacle and everything having to do with the tabernacle. And as we talked about, these elements of the tabernacle were made to be carried. Remember we talked about how it had those rings on every one of the elements that they could put those poles in, because you're not supposed to touch. You will die if you touch the Ark of the Covenant and those holy pieces. And so they had put those rods in there, be able to lift them up and carry them. And then all the different parts of the tabernacle. This is a movable sanctuary. And so imagine this big tent that we showed those pictures and all those things that go with it. Somebody's got to move that stuff. All right? And so what happens is you have the sons of Aaron, actually the sons of Levi, that are Merari, Gershon, and Kohath. Am I saying that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. These are the sons of Levi along with Aaron. Now, who's Aaron? Moses, his brother, and the high priest. Very good. So what God does in the book of Numbers is starts organizing where everybody goes and what everybody does. And so he puts Aaron and Moses right in front of the tabernacle in that area. And then he takes those other sons of Levi, Merari, Gershon, and Kohath, and he gives them jobs. And each one of them have very specific jobs. One of them is to carry the tabernacle itself, all of the framing and things like that. Another group is to carry those articles of the tabernacle and so forth. All right, and then what happens is God then, and we see this beginning in chapter 2 and forward, God then organizes where all of the different tribes are to camp around the tabernacle. Remember, what was the purpose of the tabernacle? Does anybody remember? Say again? That's where God was. That's exactly right. God wants to dwell among his people. And so there's God. Notice God right in the center, and he places the people all around him. And so you have all those 12 tribes of the nation of Israel in specific order. Does that make sense? All right? And if you read through Numbers, you'll see God given these specific places for them to be. So if you just kind of back up and think, wonder what that would look like. And so you see this tabernacle. This is an artist rendering, just a computer model. And then you think of all these tents and things like that and spread out, and you're talking 1 million to 2 million people. That is a big camp. And so it makes sense that God would organize them and have specific places for them to be. And so whenever they pack up everything and they begin to move, not only do you have people that carry specific things of the tabernacle, but there's even a specific marching progression, marching order. And so everything is organized. Now let me ask you something. Doesn't that harmonize perfectly with something we read in the New Testament? Romans chapter 14. What's that verse I'm thinking of? Let's all go to Romans chapter 14. Maybe I'm in the wrong, for 1 Corinthians 14. Yes, 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40. I said Romans, I apologize for that. I had something else in my mind. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Now, if you know the book of Corinthians, which we studied pretty extensively, you'll recognize that chapters 12, 13, and 14 deal with what? What are we dealing with? What's that? Worship. We're dealing with worship. And so, at the very end of those chapters, what does he say in verse 40? Somebody read that for me. Let all things be done decently and in order. Now, doesn't that perfectly harmonize with what we see God doing in Numbers? All right, let's go back to the book of Numbers now. So we have all of these people lined up a specific order and a specific way that God desires. And so God is dealing with man. He is teaching man to, teaching the Israelites to trust in Him. They still did not understand. See, these are some of the lessons that we learn from the book of Numbers. They still don't understand that God was the Father from heaven, and that it was going to. And it took 40 years for Him to teach them obedience and dependence. That's the other thing we'll see as we talk about the contents of the book of Numbers. We're going to see lots of things in here. God, for example, He condemns unbelief. And God hates rebellion. And there's many, many lessons that we learn from the book of Numbers. And that's why it's so important for us to study and understand the Old Testament. Romans 15:4 tells us that those things were written before time, were written for our learning, so that we might have the assurance of hope. And so that's why we read these things and we just make those connections like we did in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. We also see that this priesthood is going to be everlasting in the sense that it's going to travel through the seed of Levi and then ultimately be everlasting spiritually through Jesus Christ. Hebrews teaches us that He is our high priest and we are now the priest. Does that see where all that's connected and everything? So it's important to understand these things. All right, so if you look at your Numbers horizontal, if you will, this outline, you'll see all these the chapters out. This is why I like looking at the chapters, because it gives us an overview, and that's why I think these are so useful. I hope this will be useful for you, so whenever you want to think about those, or you're trying to remember where is that story, here's a real quick reference of the contents of all the different chapters. And so in the beginning, the people of Israel, you can also put census there, and then the Levites and their jobs. That's where that explanation of those sons of Levi are explained. He even gets into things like cleansing the camp in chapter 5, Nazirite vows, and so forth. He also talks about celebrating the Passover, so he reiterates the importance of this, about following the cloud. This is one of the things I always find fascinating about this time period, that this cloud was always present over the tabernacle. And it was in the daytime, it was a cloud, and at nighttime, it was fire. It was a flame. Can you imagine waking up in the morning and getting your cup of coffee? Oh, what a beautiful day. And open up your tent facing the tabernacle and see this cloud. and say, that's God. That is God right there. But did they understand that? That's why we have so many problems. And this shows us how thick-skulled man can be. And so God is teaching man obedience and dependence in Him. So as we continue down, what do we have in chapter 11? So we get to, as we see here, Numbers chapter 10, following this cloud, following that. In chapter 11, what happens? They begin complaining. They don't want just this bread anymore, this manna that God has provided. I just happen to know that this is one of Greg's favorite chapters. He loves this chapter about God sending the quail. And you should have a conversation with Greg, because he has done the calculations about how much quail that would be and everything. It's quite fascinating. It's a lot of... The point of it is God not only provides, but He provides abundantly. All that they need. What did Jesus say in John 10, verse 10? I've come to give them life and to give them more abundantly. And so again, you see the harmony of the Bible within this. So the people get meat. That's supposed to be in chapter 11. It says they want meat. Then Miriam, his own sister, and Aaron get a little bit prideful, a little bit jealous, and they want a little bit more power. And so they start complaining against Moses. Does anybody know that story? What happens to Miriam? She's struck with leprosy and had to be put out of the camp. And so, according to the laws even. So it's a very interesting story we read about there in those chapters. Then we have the other famous story that's quite interesting, Numbers chapter 13 and 14, where we have these spies. 12 men are chosen to go and spy out the land of Canaan, this land that's been promised to Israel. And so we have this story of those 12 men. They go, and you have the story of them going all the way up to Rahab. And then up there they pick these grapes and these pomegranates and things like that. This just land full of milk and honey. And they come back and they give this report, man, this is great. Can you imagine this? This is like Christopher Columbus coming back to Spain going, you're not going to believe it. We made it all the way to India, and there's all this stuff over there. Was that the story that they told? No, it wasn't the story. What was the story? I'm glad some of you remember. There were giants in the land. And so, did all of them have consensus on that? Were all of them? There we go. I'm glad you remember the story. Out of the 12, 10 of them came back, and they were fearful. They were advising, we don't need to go over there. There's these big giants over there. We can't beat them. But do you remember the two names? There were two of those spies. Joshua and Caleb. They said, what? You notice they had the attitude of David. David before Goliath. They're like, what are you worried about? We have God on our side. And so, what happens? God says this generation is going to perish. All right? And those 10 wound up dying of a plague. And only Joshua and Caleb was left. And so after that time, you have an entire generation that dies away. And this new generation that comes in, all right, in this process that's going on before they even enter into the land of Canaan. Now, what is the saying that you hear often about the church? The church is only one generation away from going into apostasy. I mean, it can happen even in our generation, but one generation of going off into apostasy or going off the rails because we don't teach our children. And that's what's going to happen in Deuteronomy when we get there. And then you get into some more issues and some more problems. In chapter 16, you have a group, Korah, and some of his followers. And this is called Korah's Rebellion. And Korah, again, decides that he doesn't like the way things are going, that they had life better back in Egypt, and who is this Moses and Aaron to be bossing us around and everything? And so, to make a long story short, God says, okay, Moses asked God to help. And so God says, have them fill their censers. There's about, how many was there? Does anybody know how many there were in Korah's rebellion? Say again? 200? 250 men set off to the side to put in their censers and to fill their censers and be ready. And then, this is the really interesting part, God tells Moses to tell everybody who is associated with Korah and his associates and their families to get away from their tents. And so you remember that tent city we saw a minute ago? So he's saying, get away from that entire section over there. And then God opens up the ground and swallows these people. And then the ones that had the censers with the incense in them, those were swallowed up, those were killed, and he tells them to get those censers, and they take the metal from those and they beat it down and they use it on some of the utensils, things like that, of the tabernacle. What is that teaching us? Why would God do something like that? God will not stand for disobedience or rebellion. He has set forth His law. He has set forth His spokesperson, and therefore you will obey. Now, I did that in general, all this up to this point in general. Does anybody want to add to or know more or say some more about what I've just said? All right. And then you get into, as you go forward, great stories that you need to read. Numbers is full of action. There's all kinds of things happens in the book of Numbers. And so a lot of times we start reading the book of Numbers and we see all that census and everything and we just go, oh, and we get overwhelmed. But then if you just be patient and read, and all those have their purpose, by the way, be patient and read, you'll get into these incredible stories. Well, then a little bit further, they start I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Sinning again. And this time, God sends in serpents to start biting people, and then they start suffering. And so He tells Moses to fabricate this serpent out of bronze and put it up, and those that look upon the serpent will then be saved from this. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody? Didn't Jesus reference that? That just like Moses had the serpent lifted, that so would he be lifted. You remember that? And so you have that reference from the book of Numbers. I wish we had time to get into more detail with these. But then you have this very interesting story. This is actually sometimes used as some of our children's stories, the story of Balaam and his donkey. Anybody remember this story? I love Balaam. When I say love Balaam, I love the story. Balaam, who's Balaam? He's a prophet. Okay? He's a prophet of God. And so Balak is one of the kings in the area, gets worried about Israel coming in. He saw what happened to his neighbors, and he's worried about what all these millions of people are going to do to him and his land. And so he goes and he requests that this guy named Balaam prophesy against. He wants him to prophesy and curse Israel so that they will protect them. And so he sends this entourage to go to him, and they offer Balaam all this money and stuff like that. And Balaam, his answer is, well, I can't because I have to say what God says. And so they go back and they send another one. And this time he says, well, I can't do that. And you can just see it. In my mind, I can just see him. Man, I really want that gold. I really want that silver. I really want that honor. But I can't. They come back a third time. And this time God permits him to go. Because he knows what he's going to do with him. But Balaam thinks, okay, I'm finally going to get all this gold and this silver and everything. And the whole time he's saying, I can only say what God says. So he goes there. And Balak, the king, takes him up on these hills and shows him Israel, and they set up some sacrifices and things like that, and then he goes to speak to God or get a prophecy, and God does speak to him, and God uses Balaam to bless Israel. Balak says, great, I spent all this time and money and everything to do this. All right, let me go over here to this mountain and try it over here. Does it again. 7 bulls and 7 altars and everything. Balaam's going there. And again, the word of God comes to him, and he gives him blessings. And each time, he says, what do you expect me to do, man? I told you I can only speak what the word of God tells me, what God tells me to speak. And so finally, after the third time, Balaam and Balak They just give up. They're done. Well, so they couldn't do anything, but then immediately in chapter 25, the very next chapter, you see the Israelites give in to sin. The harlots, if you will, the ladies of the night, the sensuous women, whatever you want to call them, seductresses or whatever, they come into camp, and the men and the people of Israel began to commit sexual immorality. So here, this king tries to curse them, and that didn't work, and yet Israel does it to themselves. All right, and here we have an interesting story of a young man by the name of Phinehas. Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron, and he sees what's happening, and he is indignant. He is mortified by this. Does anybody know the story? What does he do? He grabs a spear, and he runs out into the camp, and he sees two people fornicating, and he drives that spear right through them. And because of his action, God stayed the plague that he'd sent on them, if you will, in that regard. So, very interesting story. Again, you should read about Phinehas. Again, if I'm saying anything that you understand better, please. I'd love to have the help. All right. Then we get into another census taking, into the offering of the feast, division of the bounty that's come. Then we get into another thing as we get down into the end of Numbers. Now we're about to cross over into the land of Canaan, into the promised land, and God starts giving them direction as to what to do. And one of the things he sets up in Numbers chapter 35 are what's known as cities of refuge. Now, you remember last week, and even Sunday, we talked about that law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, lex talionis, and things like that. And that sometimes, even though we have these laws, thou shalt not kill, and things like that, that sometimes accidents happen, and God actually gives limits. That's actually a good law, that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, because it gives limits to what people will do, because otherwise they would take vengeance into their own hand, revenge, and just kill him, kill his whole family and everybody else because they're so mad of something that happened. Well, that's what these cities of refuge are for. If you did something like that, you could flee to one of these cities, and in these cities were the Levites, and they would then hear the case and protect the person, and the people who had a grievance against them had to go there as well to be able to talk to them. And there was all kinds of laws involved as far as when the priest died, if the other people died, what would happen as far as deliverance and things like that. But very interesting that everybody, I love that part, it says nobody had to travel more than 32 miles to reach one of them. Now, they didn't have cars. 32 miles is a long way by foot. But still, at least you had a place, a city of refuge. Now, do you see a connection here, a type, sort of an antitype of Jesus in this? What is Jesus to us? He is our, if you will, city of refuge. And so you see all these things that harmonize with the gospel. Any questions or comments on this point in Numbers? They give you pretty good refreshment as far as remembering again the book. When's the last time anybody read the book of Numbers? Has it been a while? All right, it was good. All right, so this gives you a reminder of kind of some of the things that happen, and then hopefully help you in your understanding and study even of the New Testament. So now Deuteronomy. We only have a few minutes to be able to cover this, and so I want to go over this real quick. And we'll finish up Deuteronomy this next week. Again, we have that one word, if you will, that one word that we can use for Deuteronomy. In this case, is preparation, or even the word remember. The book that my notes that I have here uses the word orations. Now, the reason it uses the word orations is because Deuteronomy is actually a collection of sermons, if you will. You can divide the book up into 4 different sermons. And the purpose, as it says there with remember, is to help the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, remember the principles of faithfulness for now and in the future. We'll get into this more next week, but as we mentioned, they are now right across the river from the land of Canaan. Moses is very old at this time. You have a whole new generation. And so this new generation needs to hear the law again. And so he repeats the law in Deuteronomy. That's basically what that means, a repetition of the law, in order for them to understand what they need to be doing now, and then when they get into this new land and possess this new land, what they need to do then. And so Deuteronomy is one of my favorite books. It's got so many themes and so many topics and so many lessons that we can learn about it. You can divide Deuteronomy in different ways, as we see here, 3 different ways. Well, I like this way, actually. One of them is looking back, looking up, and then looking ahead. And that's true whenever you look at how the chapters are broken down and the things that are involved. Again, there's sermons that are recorded. Just another one of those, that same thing, backwards, inwards, and upward. And there's all kinds, again, all kinds of lessons that we can learn in Deuteronomy. All right, so there's that map again. So you can see where we're at. If you go all the way up, now we're all the way up here. Here's the Dead Sea. Here is Jerusalem right here. And here's Jericho. And that is just on the other side of the river, Jordan. And they are right about at the foot of Mount Nebo. And I've got some pictures I'll show you next week. Go there to Mount Nebo today and look out across that valley over into that same view that Moses would have had in that time. In the last minute we have here, one of the things I do want to cover, and real quick in Deuteronomy, are these festivals, these holidays. And we'll continue this also next week. But this is one of the important parts of the law that he was given to Israel and to the priesthood and things like that. The calendar. Not only, and the point of this, not only did he organize the people in those marching manners and the way that they're going to do their camp, and the tabernacle and all of the priesthood and all of the worship, but even their time. Their time is regards to these different festivals. Now, they based everything. We have like a Gregorian calendar, those type of things, agricultural-based calendar. Well, so did they. And so what you see, one of the things you need to notice in the year is the first thing, probably the most important time, one of the most important times, is the time of rain. All right, so that's these months here, these 3 months of rain. And then you get into the times whenever you start to sow the seed and things like that. Times then different harvests that would come around, and then preparing for winter and storing up. And so a lot of these would coincide with those different dates. And we ran out of time, as I thought we would, so next week we'll pick up right in the middle of Deuteronomy here, and we'll continue. A lot of great stories to learn in that great book. Thank you so much for your attention.